Hi guys, in this video I'll be talking about content migration. This is a topic that so commonly comes up, particularly in CMS replatforming conversations. Replatforming and porting content across is one kind of migration use case. Another use case might be based on ongoing migration tasks that regularly migrate content from one system to another. And there are of course other unique use cases as well. In this video, however, we're going to focus on the first, as this is the most common scenario and also utilizes more of the features of the Management API. We're going to see not only content data migration, but also data object creation, including establishing data entity relationships. Now, there are so many ways to tackle content migration, but there are commonly three constants in a typical migration. The source, so typically an incumbent CMS, where data structures and content need to be extracted in hopefully their entirety, not limited to a CMS. This could of course be a CRM, an ERP, a spreadsheet, or even a CSV file. There's the destination, so commonly the new and shiny CMS into which the data must be imported and data structures recreated. So in our case, this is Kontent.ai. And finally, the third is an adapter. So typically an application which pulls data from the source system, processes it in some way, and then pushes it into the destination system. In this video, I'm going to show you a particular adapter, the CLI JavaScript application built by the engineers at Kontent.ai. Here's the GitHub repo. However, I'm going to be using the boilerplate, also kindly created by the Kontent.ai engineers, which uses the CLI application, but also provides some great migration scripts for us, which we can run and get a good idea of how migration scenarios are handled in code and how they affect what's in the CMS itself. You can see we've got migration files in here. So we'll be using those extensively in the code demo coming up shortly. Now, as a first step, I've created an empty Kontent.ai project. There's no content types. Content model is empty. There are no content items. So it's a brand new blank Kontent.ai project. I've also cloned this GitHub repo. So I've now got it running locally on my machine. Now let's jump into the code and have a look what we've got here. So we've got those migration files as we saw earlier, and this is our file system here. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to follow some instructions that are on GitHub. So firstly, let's just go back and see. So first we have to run npm install, so to install all the dependent packages. So let's do that. That's done. So let's have a look what the next step is. So we've got to set up an environment variable file, and we need our project ID and we need our management API keys. So if we go into Kontent.ai, we get those from here. So there's our project ID and our management API keys here. So let's run that script. And here's a version that I prepared earlier. So that will create an environment variable file for us. There we go. Here it is. So let's jump back into that migrations folder and we can see our scripts here. So they're all prefixed with a number, which gives us a nice order to execute them in. Remember, this is a boilerplate to help you get up and running quickly with a migration. So these scripts are samples that each tell part of a larger migration story. This includes creating content types, updating content types, creating content type relationships, and populating data. So let's have a look at the first migration script here. I'll touch on the specifics of the code at a very high level, but I've added a link in the description below to the Management API documentation. So if you want to review how we use the Management API in more detail, check out that link. So at the top here, we're using the Management API client, and we're creating a content type which represents a blog post. So you see this function there corresponds to this here. So we're creating a blog post content type. It is of codename blog, and we've got 3 elements. So we've got a title, which is text, we've got an author, which is text, and we've got text, which is also text. So let us run this script and let's see what actually happens. So I'll put it in here. So that's been run successfully. So let's have a look at how that affected our CMS. So we'll go back in the content model. And here we are. So we now have a new content type that's been created for us. And you can see those 3 elements, title, author, and text, that we just saw in the code. Now, before we move on, I always like to make a note whenever I use API keys in my videos. So whenever I reference API keys, I always delete the project before the video is published. Hence, these keys are useless. But of course, in the real world, these API keys should be kept secure, and caution should be definitely exercised if sharing them with anyone. So that said, back to our migration scripts. Okay, so let's go back into Visual Studio Code and let's have a look at our second migration script. So here we go. So this one looks like it's going to create a blog item for us. And as we can see here, we're using add content item as per the API client. And here we're adding a blog content type item with these fields. So we've got a title of about coffee, we've got an author, Coffee Geek, and the main text is here. So it's a longer piece of text. Okay, great. So let's see what happens when we run this script. So let me paste that in and run it. Okay, that's run successfully. So let's go back into the CMS. So we should have a content item here, and we do. Perfect. So this has created that content item for us based on that blog content type. Okay, so back to our content model, and let's have a look at the third migration script here. So this particular one creates a second content type, which is an author. So we can see here it's an author, that's the code name, and there are 2 elements. There is the name, which is text, and there's a Twitter handle, which is also the text. Great, so let's run this one and let's see how our content model is affected in the CMS. Great, it's run successfully. So we've got blog here, the content type, the only one, and if I refresh, we've now got author as well. So let's have a look. So here are those 2 elements that we saw: name, Twitter handle, name, Twitter handle. Okay, so going back to our migration scripts. This next one's going to be an interesting one. It's going to update the blog content type, and it's going to create a new element. So if we go to our content model and look at the blog content type, we're going to create a new element in here, and it will be a linked item element, which will allow for the author content type. So this is an example of related data. We've got 2 content types with a relationship. So let's run the script and let's see how that affects our content model. Okay, let's run, and if we refresh, So that's created this new element for us. And if we expand that to see the details, you can see we're allowing the author content type. So the next script will show a bit more of a complex scenario. Let's have a look at this blog content type. We've got two elements that pertain to an author. We've got the original text field, and we've got this more sophisticated linked author, which links to an author content item within the CMS. If we go to content and assets and we look at our blog, you can see we've got our author, Coffee Geek, but we don't actually have a linked author because there are no author content items yet. There is the type that we've got in our content model, but we don't have the items yet. So what this next script is going to do is going to iterate all the blog content items. It's going to get the author value from this text element, and then it's going to create a linked author based on that value if that author does not already exist as a content item. So let's jump into Visual Studio Code and let's have a look at that script. So here it is. Now, if this is moving a bit fast or some things don't make sense, remember you can always go to the GitHub repo. For this boilerplate, I've added that link in the description, and you can just review this file and just go over it, and it'll start to make sense as you see the logic that's been added. But I guess covering it at a high level, here we're getting all the blog content items. Then we're finding the value of the old author, so we're iterating them in a for loop, so we're getting that value of that old author. And then we're looking for a matching content item. If one doesn't exist, we're creating it. And lastly, we're updating that blog content item with that linked item that's being freshly created. So let's run the script and let's have a look at how that eventuates in our CMS. Okay, so that's been run. So let's go back into content and assets. So you can see Coffee Geek's being created. So there we are. And if we go to the blog, there we go. There's our Coffee Geek content item that's been added here, and that's been used by this text element field here originally. So that's a pretty cool example of a scenario where if you had a lot of data and you had to add this new element, and then you didn't want somebody to manually iterate, go through, pull from one element, and then create another link somewhere in another element, that would be like a big manual process. This is a great example of where a migration script would come into play and really just eliminate most of the legwork there. Okay, so now that we've got this more sophisticated way of referencing an author, so we've got this linked item against the blog content type, this author element field is actually redundant. We don't need this anymore as we're now linking actual content items. So what the next script is going to do is it's going to do another update on the blog content type, but it's going to remove this redundant element. So let's have a look in the content model. There's our blog. So this will be essentially deleted. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code and let's have a look at that script. So we're doing a modification, we're modifying the content type, and we're removing an element here, as you can see. So let's run this script and let's see what happens. Done. Back into the CMS. So if I refresh now, that author text element is now gone, and we're just left with this linked author. And if we go to content and assets, we can see that as well when we look at the blog. So that's gone. We've got one script left to run, and what the next script will do is it will publish our content. So if we go to our content items, you can see they're all in the draft step of the workflow. If we open up the workflow here, you can see so they're in the draft step. The next step is published, then archived. So what the next script will do is it will move those content items from draft to published. So let's have a look in Visual Studio Code. So there we are. So this is doing an author and a blog published. So let's run that script, and then let's have a look at what happens in the CMS. So that's our final script done. And if we go back to the CMS, and if I refresh, those two content items are now published. So those are some great examples, albeit with a very small subset of data. Where the real power comes into play with migrations such as this is when we're dealing with large amounts of data. So if you can imagine, if we had hundreds or thousands of blog items being migrated, or likewise authors and any other content type as well. If we go back into this script file here, you can see we've hard-coded some values to create our blog item, but this could be iterating a CSV file, for example, or some other data source that has thousands of line items. And upon each iteration, the management API would be creating a new content item. So that's where the real power would come in. And those are the sorts of conversations that we're hearing quite often when people are looking at migrating from their incumbent CMS platform to Kontent.ai. And as we've seen in these examples, this is very much achievable. But of course, as with most things, there are caveats. Just because something is doable doesn't mean that it's entirely feasible. A migration can be simple, requiring a handful of content types with some basic relationships and then a mass data import. A migration can also be extremely complex and include several hundred data structures with very complicated relationships involving millions of content items, which are difficult to port across due to the underlying complexity of the original data structure. Another point to consider is that if moving to a new CMS like Kontent.ai is one of the reasons perhaps that existing data modeling on the incumbent platform was not up to the task and inadvertently resulted in a poor content model, should you be replicating this in the new platform? Should you instead use this opportunity to do things right this time around? There are points to consider very carefully, as a data migration can both be a blessing and a curse. You may in fact want to consider a middle ground approach where you rebuild your content model, then import only some data that's processed to fit the updated content types. With the examples we saw just now, an adapter such as this is a great way to achieve this, as we have control by being able to write code and to do whatever manipulations we need. As always, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this video was useful in highlighting one very good approach to the data migration question that really is asked so often.